In this conversation, Brian and I are going to review Module 2 of the Life After Pornography program and share our insights on the paradox of control and how our mind's efforts to control things that are not controllable actually end up with us having less control. I know I said control a lot, but it's a really important principle. So I hope you enjoy this conversation on Module 2 of the Life After Pornography program. If you're like me, you know your mind can be your best or your worst friend. Our mind is an amazing tool that can do incredible things, but our mind can also create problems out of nowhere. Sometimes our mind keeps recommending the same solutions to problems even when they aren't working. I see this pattern play out as individuals try to overcome their anxiety, depression, or even struggles with pornography, using approaches that make sense but aren't very helpful. This podcast will show you how real researchers and clinicians are changing the way we approach mental health and reveal helpful research-supported principles designed to help real people with real problems. My name is Dr. Cameron Staley, and welcome to the Life After Series Radio. So I'm back with Brian, and we're going to continue walking through the Life After Pornography program. So I hope you enjoyed our last chat on Module 1. So we're going to jump into Module 2, which is the paradox of control. I even like that language. I totally nerd out about this stuff. Like, oh boy, we get to talk about act stuff and concepts that for me were quite paradigm altering. And I think maybe I'm still sentimental about that, where these things shifted my perspective about how I approach my own life, mental health, how I think about my mind. And I found just learning these concepts to be so helpful in so many areas of my life that I still get excited about these concepts. Even though I've learned these like a decade ago, they're still fresh and exciting because they're so applicable for so many things.
I love it. I'm on the same boat, but from a very different, very different side of things. I'm excited in the way that I know they help make life a lot better. So I do love the language too, and someone who has struggled with this, the control word is very strong.
Yeah.
And so I'm excited to dive in and tear this one apart.
Well, let's start there, because for me, control often is the problem. And I'd say specifically or particularly with anxiety concerns or any compulsive behavior. Usually I hear really early on with someone who's struggling with any of those areas, they're like, I want to control it. And I hear the C word over and over and over. And it's like, yeah, like this is why anxiety has gotten worse over the years, or compulsive behaviors have gotten worse, is we're trying to control things that aren't controllable. And as we do that, they become less controllable, and it just gets bigger. And for me, it's like trying to get a firm grip on water. It's like, well, you can't really do that. I mean, you can grab a tennis ball, but to grab water, I mean, it's just not going to work. And the harder you try, the less water you're going to hold. And I think you can hold water in your hands and kind of cup it there, but the second you try to control it, it's gone. And I think we do that same thing with, well, I can control so many things in my life. I should be able to control my thinking and my body sensations and these urges and these emotions, because I can control everything else. And it's really just a trick of our mind where it's like, it's so good at control. It thinks it can control everything. But this stuff internally really operates with a different principle. So I'm curious, like, your experience or reaction when you hear the word control, or how you've used it in the past.
Yeah, I just looking at my experience kind of zoomed out. I've brought up this example before, but like the gym of I can control if I go and what I do and how hard I work out. And that was almost like a coping mechanism for my coping mechanism of pornography at some points. Like, and being in control of that made me feel better. But I think a lot of, and like in talking to friends, like you can control like taking on more shifts at work and like making yourself busier.
Mm.
And you get used to being in control. And then when you're not in control of your emotions, it throws you for a loop. And I think that's where you get stuck in that rut of, why can I control everything else in my life? Like with some Mad Bunny ears on that, and not be able to control my viewing of pornography. Like that doesn't make any sense. Like, why can't I just white knuckle this when I can white knuckle everything else?
Yeah. I think that's a big part of it. And so sometimes I think about this as the inside outside rule, and that's all in module 2 here, where I'd say our mind is pretty much able to control like 95% of our experiences. And I don't know an exact number on that, but if you think about all the things in the outside world, like you said, going to the gym, or what you're eating, or studying for an exam, or cleaning your house, your mind knows how to look at the situation, analyze the problem, determine what the steps are, and get it done. And basically the principle on the outside world stuff is like, the harder you work at it, the more you're going to get done, and the more you're in control. And that works most of the time. And so our mind is like, okay, that rule works most of the time. It's probably going to work on inside stuff too, like thoughts and emotions and urges. But the stuff on the inside of us really operates by a different principle. And it seems like the more you try to control it, the less control you have. And that's really different. Our mind's like, I don't accept that, because I can control 95% of things. I will figure out how to control this. And I've seen that with anxiety, where it just escalates. The more you try to control it, the more anxious you feel. And I think about even that word control, as we've done research on language, that word control, and even words like trying, activate our sympathetic nervous system. That fight or flight response kicks in. And those are the physical sensations we experience with anxiety. And then when you tell yourself, you got to control this, that just activates that fight or flight response. And you feel even less control. So it's amazing. The more you say, I got to control my anxiety, the opposite's going to happen. That's really just how that principle works. And then the other thing works too, where it's like, I want to feel more happiness here. You're probably going to feel less. But if it's like, I want to clean a room, it's like, well, clean it more, it will be cleaner. Like that principle works in the outside world, but internally, the more you try to feel an emotion, the less you got it. And the less you try to feel an emotion, the more you got it.
With language too, isn't the word should, like I should be feeling this way?
Wow.
Like that was the first thing that came to my mind right there too, is like, I should be able to control this, because I'm sure a lot of other people have had this too. I was always complimented on my discipline.
Oh,
which made it so much worse when I couldn't discipline this.
yeah.
And I think, again, it's that language of, well, it's separating it, because I think you're right. Like internally, these emotions come naturally, urges come naturally, and they aren't meant to be controlled.
Right.
They're meant to be like understood and accepted, and it's all, I mean, that's like the mindfulness approach to letting it come in, and if you want to interact with it, you can, or you can just let it go by. Like, but thinking the discipline is like not even letting it come in the first place.
Yeah.
That's the dangerous control.
Yep.
Or at least in my experience.
I think you're right on. And it is our thinking about it. And our mind's so good at thinking about so many different random things. Like you might have a belief that I should be able to control a river. And if a dam breaks, I should be able to stop that. Like we can basically come up with any rule. And I often refer to these as verbal rules. They're basically rules created by language, where I should be able to dunk a basketball. I strongly believe that, but however, my athletic ability and gravity says otherwise. But I still have a belief that I love basketball. I've tried really hard. I should be able to dunk it. And that belief really isn't based on any real world contingencies. But that belief that I have causes me to stress, where it's like, now what's wrong with me? Why can't I dunk this basketball? I should be able to. I've tried really, really hard. And so our mind can think of all kinds of rules, and shoulds are, I think, a cue that, oh, there's a rule that's probably not based on a contingency in your environment, or else you wouldn't be using the word should. Should is like our mind saying, I'm not able to control this situation, so I'm going to tell myself a story that I should, even though it's really not aware of what's actually happening in your environment.
That's a powerful cue and like a powerful reminder of if you're using should a lot to look at those stories and beliefs that you're telling yourself. Because I think that's, and I'm going to try and get your approval. It's the dissonance that creates the problem, right?
Yep.
Of your belief, but then, or like contrasting beliefs.
You're right on. And I'd say so much of human suffering comes from we have these expectations, or we could say verbal rules that are inconsistent with our reality and our experience. And that gap between what our mind told us this should be like and what it's really like is where a lot of suffering comes from. And our mind's like, wow, this isn't what I want it to be. I'm going to rise that expectation even more, instead of actually meeting that expectation of what's really going on. And a lot of this is just how powerful our mind is. It just comes from that place. So this second module, we start with a body scan. And kind of the reason why I positioned that mindfulness exercise is to get people out of their mind. This is where control lives. This is where shoulds lives. All these verbal rules, all these expectations. And so I found a lot of benefit in just scanning your body. And body scans are simple, where it's like, oh, attend to your toes, now your feet, work yourself up your calves, notice any tension, work your left leg, your right leg, and you just go up your body. But what I found is, as you're attending to your body, it really naturally helps your attention into your body and leave this thought world that causes so many problems. And I find body scans to be so relaxing, but also so informative, where it's like, oh, my knee is kind of creaky, or I notice an itch right below my earlobe right here, or I'm feeling really tired, or actually I'm sitting in a weird posture. And these are cues that I neglect as I just hang out in the world of thoughts. And getting back into our body helps us to be more receptive to the information, emotions, and urges and thoughts are trying to communicate to us. So when I think about the role of thinking and emotions and physical sensations, they're just efforts in communication. And it's like, why would we want to control that? Like you said, we want to listen to that. That's quite helpful. But I know for me, the challenge is when emotions are trying to communicate to me, I don't like how that feels. So I'm like, I don't like this feeling. I want to control it. Instead of like, oh, wait, it's probably communicating something really important. I should listen to it. And when I do, that emotion kind of settles down. But often I'm like, I don't want to listen to it. I just want to control it. But then if we don't listen to it, it's just going to get louder. It's just trying to communicate something quite meaningful. But our mind's like, I don't like it. I do the communicating. You listen to me. Don't listen to those emotions that are actually in tune with your environment, because then my mind is going to be out of a job. And I want to be the most important employee in your life. So ignore your emotions, ignore your body, just listen to your thinker. And I think that happens to a lot of us.
I love that. And I think it's so important to be on the same page with ourselves. And so often we're not. And I think that, to like bring up another positioning thing, like with the Life After Pornography program itself, you mentioned that gap between the expectations and the reality. I think of these first two modules do a really good job of like matching that, and you're in a lot better space to kind of reframe your perspective.
Mm.
And sorry, that wasn't just like a throw out compliment. That's like, I genuinely think that was like intentionally there so that you can come back down from that. And I love the language around being like a grounded individual or being down to earth.
Yep.
They always say like, oh, you're humbled to the dust, or, you know, like brought down. Like, I love that language of you're always up here in your thoughts and on cloud nine, and clouds aren't stable. There's no foundation. You fall straight through them, but like the ground is like solid.
Yep.
And you coming down to that, being on the same page with yourself and in tune with your body and your emotions and your urges and your thoughts, having that all grounded. Like, when I think of someone who's grounded, those are the traits and attributes that I think of as they don't lash out. They're not uncontrollable. They're very stable and sturdy.
Yeah.
And it's that matching of reality and expectation and being mindful. And it's cool that all that works together holistically.
I love that language. I think that's so well said. And I think that grounding occurs when we're grounded in our body, that there's not like sure foundation in thinking. Because we can think all kinds of wild things that are untrue. We have so many beliefs that are not founded on anything. There's not a lot of sure footing there. But I think in your body, we can accomplish that. And so I think the reason why a lot of people struggle is sitting in our bodies uncomfortable. And so it's like our thoughts are cleaner, but they're also sometimes less reliable. And I think these first couple modules are trying to help people maybe get out of the thoughts a little bit more. And I know this is true for me, that if I have a thought, I believe it is fact. Like if I think it, it's probably true. And that doesn't make any sense at all. But I think that's how we interact with our thoughts. I thought it, it's true. It's got to be true. And some thoughts are true-ish, but a lot of thoughts aren't. Like, they're opinions. And I think about most of our thinking is just opinion generators. It's just talk radio. It's not really empirically based. And I think about empiricism, it's based on experience. And that's kind of what we're shooting for with ACT. It's like, let's listen to your experience. And so some of the stories we tell in this module are to start to get people to think about what your mind's telling you and what your experience is telling you. And you said this was the hardest video for you to watch, the jelly donut video.
Oh yeah. You better eat a big meal before module 2, or else you're gonna be in a world of hurt.
So set the stage. What's the story here?
So what I love about it is, again, I think it's that perspective, the paradigm shift of like our minds can't not do something, they can only do. And so not thinking about the jelly donut, right? Like, literally impossible. And I think it's the simplicity of that like analogy that really gets you to understand that I've spent my whole day for the past 10 years thinking about like porn. Of course I'm going to think about it.
Yeah.
And it's another one of those like frustratingly laughable concepts where you're like, oh, I wish I could have learned that 10 years ago, but I'm glad I have 10 years of experience now to look back on and see how valid that statement is. Of if I've spent so long fighting this in my abstract thoughts of not having them grounded, how much I've been fighting this, how much harder that has made the struggle.
Yep.
And so it does present it very simply, and using like hunger and like a jelly donut is like your basic need, right? And so having something so fundamental as like hunger and feeding it, but then like an urge and like fulfilling it, like it's like a very relevant concept. And so I don't know, it it uh it goes back to like control for me, because this might be another rant in itself, but in like the outside world, it starts with my head, and I say, okay, I want to move my leg, like I can move it.
Hmm.
Um, but like mentally, we only have that like one option. Did that make so? Like I have the choice to move my leg or not, but I don't have the choice to not think about moving my leg.
Oh, yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that illustrates that principle that, like going back to the hunger example and the jelly donut, that, we can choose to eat a jelly donut, but we can't choose our hunger or our innate desire to eat a jelly donut. Like we're programmed to like sugar and sweets, just like we are sexual images. It's just something that's innate. And yet our mind's saying, no, I'm on a diet. I shouldn't like this jelly donut. And so I'm going to spend the rest of this day trying not to think about eating this wonderfully delicious jelly donut. I don't want it. It's bad for me. I've made promises and commitments. I just really need to not think about this. And our mind can't not think about things. And like you said, you spent 10 years trying not to think about pornography. And as we try to not think about something, we're really only thinking about it. And I think that's the challenge here is our mind is so eager to help us with any problems that it's like, okay, if you want to not do something, I'll really work on trying not to do it. And it's like our mind can do things. It's really good at planning and carrying out decisions and actions. It can't not do something. And I think this is an odd thing. Like I've tried to think about other situations, like almost to try to create a problem where it's like, Brian, I want you to start to think about how many times you almost hit somebody on the road, like going on a crosswalk. And I want you to really think about that, and that it's really important not to think about hitting somebody on a crosswalk because that's really dangerous. I mean, you're in a vehicle, they're a pedestrian. I want you to start to track how many times that you think about hitting somebody on a crosswalk because this is really important. And it's so important. I want you to think about it most of the day to keep people safe. Like, what would that be like for you if I asked you to start to track how often you think about potentially accidentally hitting somebody?
Well, my first response would be I'd never drive because then you just avoid it altogether. But like, no, that makes so much sense because then you're so focused on that you're probably going to end up hitting people as they're crossing the street.
Yeah.
And that's like, I'm so thankful you're here to make sense of my crazy thoughts and words. You're like translating. But like a breakup, this is such a, I don't want to say immature example, but like you break up with someone and like all of a sudden every inside joke, every experience, every memory, everything you've ever had with that person is like suddenly brought up.
Yep.
That's all you can think about and that's all you see and you're hypersensitive to everything. And it's like a prolonged breakup with pornography of like you see something even remotely, I don't even know, you can see anything and like have it tie back to pornography and then all of a sudden now that's a temptation and you have to act on that. Like it makes so much sense now understanding why the brain does that
Yep.
and how flawed that model is, that like trying not to think about is going to make it so much worse.
I love that dating example. I've never thought about that. But often you hear like, oh, you need to try to move on. And it's like, the more you try to move on, the more you're going to remember all of those things. And so our mind just does that, where it's like, you shouldn't be thinking about porn. You shouldn't be thinking about your previous partner. You shouldn't be thinking about these losses. And the more you try not to have those experiences, the more you have them. They just become
Yeah.
even more present. Like you said, you're even more aware of all the associations linked to a partner or pornography. And that's the paradox of control. And so this inside world stuff works like that, where if you can't have it, you got it. And that's the struggle with pornography and these urges. Like, I absolutely do not want to have this struggle. You got it. If you can't have it, you got it.
That's the motto, right? I love that. And I love how easy it is to validate that too. Like, try and go this next week without eating sugar.
Mm.
And like, but tell your, like, you can't think about sugar, right? And you're going to make it a day, right? And then you're
Yeah.
thinking about it so much that you're going to eat sugar. Like, it's such a, once you understand it, it makes so much sense.
I love that sugar example, because our mind's like, both of those are equal. I can not eat sugar and also not think about sugar. It's like they're the same thing to our mind. It doesn't differentiate those. But the reality is, like, I've thought about like not eating sugar as much. And I'm like, well, that's impossible. I can't do that. But it's like, no, like if you gave me $10,000 to not eat sugar for a week, I would have $10,000 at the end of the week. I promise you, I wouldn't eat sugar. But if you're like, well, I'll give you $10,000 if you don't think about sugar, it's like, I can't. Like, that's impossible. But our mind's like, oh yeah, we can control that stuff. And it's like, no, you can control eating sugar, but desiring sugar, thinking about sugar, wanting sugar, we can't. The more we try to control that, the more we're going to think about it. And it's the same thing with sexuality and sexual images. The more you're like, I can't have this in my life, it's basically just putting a giant billboard for pornography right in front of your windshield. And it's like, I can't look at that. It's like, well, now you're only looking at that. That's how our mind works. And I think our mind's not aware of that rule. It just isn't. But like you said, your experience came to know this rule. It learned this rule, and your mind is not aware of it. And so we have to somehow be able to step back from our thinking and observe what it's good at and what it's not aware of. Thinking's good at so many things. It's just not aware of its own limitations.
And that's what I love about mindfulness, is that it creates the space where you can zoom out and see that, like, it's not just one, it's separating the urge or the thought from the action, because you're giving yourself like space to understand it and then choose to act one way or the other.
Yep.
And it's not controlling what comes in, it's controlling what you do with what comes in.
Yep.
And that's the important shift, because if you're spending your time trying to control what comes in, you're going to end up like exhausted and frustrated and doing the same thing you've been doing for years on end, because it's just uncontrollable.
You're right. And I think it's not that it doesn't work, it's that it can't work. And I think we focus so much on trying to control thoughts, emotions, urges, that we forget that our behavior is 100% in our control all of the time. I believe that's a fact. And some people with porn, they're like, no, it's not. Like, I can't control it. It's like, I promise you, if I offered you enough money to not look at pornography, like $1 million to not look at pornography for a week, you'd be a millionaire. It's like, we can do that. But if it's like, well, I'll pay $1 million to not have an urge or sexual thought, we can't do that. And that's where we've been stuck for so long, is our mind's like, okay, the problem is the urge. I got to control the urge, and then I can control the behavior. And the reality is the urge is not as relevant, but our mind is fixated on, we got to control that. That's where it starts. And it's like, no, we need to be aware of it, create some space for it, be curious about it. But we're choosing to view sexual images or not. The urge isn't. Like when you're aware of an urge and can look at it and inspect it, you can disobey it. It's amazing. And I do the same thing. I have to walk myself through this with my cell phone now, where after I finish a session or a lecture, I get this impulse to say, check your messages, check your email, check your texts. And it feels so automatic, and it's a strong urge. And like I automatically pull my phone out and start checking my messages. And I realize, I'm like, wait a minute, I can have an urge to check my phone and keep it in my pocket. I don't need to obey those impulses or those urges. And so I honestly have that conversation with myself and say, yeah, that's an urge. Would you like to satisfy that urge? Or why don't you take a break, maybe enjoy this walk? You can check those messages in 10 minutes. But I actually like practicing disobeying impulses and urges. I find that so helpful. But first I need to be aware of, oh, I just had an impulse to check something. And when I'm aware of it, I can now disobey it. And I find that so empowering that I can have an overwhelming urge to check my phone and not do it. I can disobey that urge.
It's so powerful, because once you understand what you can't control, you can start to act on what you can control.
Yep.
And it's so freeing.
Yeah.
And it's so much better than living the other way around. And it's so ironic too, because we are so focused on that control, but we're trying to control the wrong thing.
Yep.
And so in reality, using these principles will give you so much more control. Again, 10 years earlier, oof. But
yep. That's the paradox. Once you give up
yeah,
control of the uncontrollable, you start to have control.
translate it again. There it is.
It's amazing. And I think our mind's not aware of that, and it's not aware of the pressures we put on ourselves. And so I like the eating one with dieting, because that's probably relatable for a lot of us. But often we don't think about like desiring a jelly donut is sinful or disgusting, or you're an unworthy person if you desire this jelly donut. You're like, well, it maybe is not healthy for me. It's not the best calories. But I don't feel like, oh my gosh, if my partner knew I really wanted to eat a jelly donut, they might leave me. They might reject me. My family might not want anything to do with me. May not be able to worship in my church if they knew I wanted chocolate icing on a donut. Like, it doesn't have that same kind of connotations. And so if you think about anything in the sexual realm, it's basically like wanting a jelly donut, but then we attach all these other things, and they're just pressures, where it's like now there's even more pressure not to want a jelly donut, because if you do, you're going to go to hell, and you're disgusting, and you're a deviant, and you're not safe. And it's like, oh my gosh, I got to work even harder to not want a jelly donut. And it just makes the billboard even larger and closer to your face. That's all it does. But our mind doesn't recognize how pressures work like that. It thinks about like, no, this is really, really important. I'm going to show you how important it is to motivate you to get into more control of this problem. And it's like, that's not how our nervous system works. The more we try to control it, the less control we have. And adding more pressure, it doesn't improve our ability to control these things. It does the opposite. But our mind's like, no, like if I'm behind on an assignment, I'm going to work harder and get it done. Like that pressure and motivation's good. It just doesn't work the same way with this internal stuff, with our thoughts, emotions, and urges.
I love that too, because fundamentally it is the same. It's a jelly donut. But you add the shame and the stigmas and the worthiness and the language, and all of a sudden now it's jelly donut or hell, right? Like those are your only options. Like it gets that dramatic.
Yeah.
And obviously that doesn't help, because that just ramps up the intensity of those emotions that you're already trying to control that aren't able to be controlled. And it's, again, it's like understanding that is so powerful. And so I'm so glad that these beginning modules take you through that process of understanding this.
Yeah.
Because again, it is such a powerful paradigm shift to say, like, I've been doing this for 12 years, like, dang it.
Yep.
But understanding why, and now saying, okay, let's create a space to control what we can control and understand what we can't. And then life is so much easier to navigate.
It is. And that's the secret, is our behaviors are actually in our control. And that's module 3 that we'll get to next time, about how we can really unlock that. And that principle of willingness, it's my favorite. I probably think about that principle more than any other principle with ACT, because it all comes down to that. But I think the reason why people have struggled with things like pornography for so long, like you mentioned, it's more about how our mind's been approaching the problem. And our mind's just not aware of that. And it says, well, it's got to be these sexual images. They are just so darn powerful and so addicting. That's why we're struggling. It couldn't be that how I'm trying to fix it isn't working. It's not that. It's got to be these sexual images. And I think even treatment providers buy into that same story, where it's like, whoa, yeah, this has been a really long-term problem, and I can't get people to control their urges either. It must be these really powerful sexual images. And I don't think it's because people are like not smart or intelligent or working hard. This is just how our mind operates. This is universal. Is our mind is really good at thinking and solving problems. It just doesn't have like a self-check that is it working or not. It doesn't. But mindfulness is what allows us to actually start to monitor our mind. And these first 2 modules really are trying to get that. Instead of like viewing this problem through our mind's lens, we're going to start to pull back a little bit more and look at, what role has your mind played in maintaining this problem? And your mind is never going to suggest that possibility. It just isn't. It doesn't have that ability. It's just there to solve problems. It's not there to think about if it's actually solving them or not. But we have that ability. We have this meta-awareness ability that we can step back, and instead of becoming our thoughts, we can observe our thoughts and understand them and see a bigger picture. And yeah, that's why, as we talked about last time, you can't skip the mindfulness stuff. It's necessary to cultivate that ability to be able to look at our thoughts instead of being completely fused with our thinking.
I even just love the word mindfulness, because it's almost ironic in nature that we're like using our mind to be aware of our mind.
Yeah.
Like it's almost separating like 2 different parts of your thinking as like that might be a little abstract, but zooming out on your thoughts is like a whole, and being able to, like you said, step back and look at those without just becoming those thoughts.
Yeah. And it's hard to do. And I think it's the thing I appreciate about ACT is how we get out of these thinking ruts is we use metaphor. We use images. We use things that are relatable. And I think about the master teachers I've respected over the years, teaching stories that are relatable. And I think about Christ. He taught in parables. And those parables could reach so many different people and apply to so many scenarios, because it's disrupting the way we traditionally think about things. And these are really simple parables or metaphors that we share. And the reason why they work is our mind can't overthink them. And that allows us to actually step out of that thinking for a little bit and see it from another way. And so I like these metaphors and stories all throughout Life After Pornography. And sometimes, often as I present these to people, their mind's like, okay, what does this mean? And now what am I supposed to do with it? It's like, don't overthink it. Like, these metaphors are like doodles. They're like these little works of art. They're not designed to be an oil painting that you can write an essay on. They're really just designed to get us out of thinking ruts. And often these parables and these metaphors really resonate with our experiences. And that's why I think about some of the parables from the New Testament. I remember those stories. I don't remember actual words or some of the laws of Moses in the Old Testament, but I remember parables. They impact me and they grow with you as you grow and evolve, and they apply across situations. And that's what's so meaningful about our experience, is it's so robust and flexible, and our thinking is not. It often gets so rigid and stuck about, this is how we do it, this is how we fix it. But thinking in these images and metaphors, they're just an incredible way to be able to step back and observe thinking for what it really is.
I have never thought about it like that. So thank you. That's a very cool insight. And it just makes sense that our minds would be more receptive to those.
Yeah.
On the other side, I have also watched many of your videos and been like, wait, does this have a double meaning? Or like, there's got to be some ambiguity in here. Like, give me something else to work with. But it is just, you can't outthink it.
Yep. Yeah, my favorite response to people when I'm working with them and sharing some of these stories, they're like, I don't quite get that. And I'm like, that's perfect. That's exactly where I want you to be. Like, I'm not exactly sure what this means. I'm like, perfect. Don't spend more time thinking on this. That's not the goal, to understand it. Like, what was the jelly donut metaphor supposed to teach me? It's like, it's not supposed to. It's supposed to help you get out of a rut and reflect. And so our mind's like, but I got to figure this out. Like, what's the principle? It's like, yeah, there is a principle there. But the more you try to grasp it, the less you're going to get it. It goes back to that control. It's more like these ideas and metaphors are there to resonate with your experience. And part of us gets that and can see a bigger picture. Then our mind's like, oh, I'll swoop in and answer all these questions for you, and just erases the whiteboard. It's like all those things that you learned and connected with, your mind's like, I erased it all. What were we talking about? It's like, oh, thanks, mind. Like, you just totally wiped it all away. And that's the beauty of this. So if people are going through these modules where it's like, I don't really know what I was supposed to get by that. It's like, there's not necessarily something you're supposed to get. I mean, there's general principles in these, but probably people are getting different things from them, and that's okay. And that's what I've loved leading the groups with ACT, is we drop one of these little metaphors and just allow people to share and reflect. And I always like, wow, the places these can go and the parts of our experience it connects with is so amazing. And I just can't tell people, like, you need to think this way differently. It just doesn't work that way. If it did, it'd actually be a lot easier, and I would prefer that. It just doesn't work that way. I can't say, Brian, you're thinking about this wrong. You need to think about it like this. It just doesn't work. We have to connect with our experience. And that, for me, is ACT and why it's so effective.
It's understanding what you can't control and controlling what you can. There it is.
Yep. I think going back to control, like what you just said right there, reminds me of kind of the 12 steps motto. And I don't know the motto. Did they talk about the motto in the addiction programs you went to? Like, give me the wisdom to know what I can control. Like, did that sound familiar?
Yeah, it was brought up, but not repeated. I mean, we didn't have to, at least in our group, we didn't stand up and hold up a sign or something and read that one off. But
because I actually really like that motto, where it's like, help me understand what I can control and let go of things I can't. It's like that principle rings true to me. And I think about the reason why there is an appeal to a 12 steps addiction model. And the appeal is control, where it's like, okay, I'm struggling with something I can't control. Oh, here's 12 steps. I know how to count. It's linear. There's a shared language. We meet at a certain date and time. Oh, good. I am now in control again. I'm in good shape. And your mind's going to say, fantastic. We're in control. Just keep doing these steps. Keep going to meetings. You're going to be in good shape. And your mind loves structure. But it's not aware of, actually, that structure didn't change your behavior, though. And that was your goal. Remember, like a long time ago when we started this, your goal was to change behavior. But instead, your mind's like, no, my goal is to be in control. And these 12 steps in this addiction approach gave me that illusion of control. I am content. It's like done. It like stops. Like my work is finished. We're feeling in control. It's just not aware of, but that didn't change your behavior. And that's what we're shooting for.
I love how our minds do that. Because I remember when I first pulled up the LAP program, it was like 10 modules, like awesome. Like I know what's going to happen. I'm going to crank through all these in like 10 days. I'm going to do one a day. I'm going to be in control and I'm going to do this faster than it says. And you know, like how wrong was I? But
Yep. Yeah, you're right. Our mind likes numbers and likes steps. And I tried to be intentional calling these modules. They're not steps. They're principles. But when I'm working with somebody individually, I don't do module 1, then module 2, and we work our way to module 10. Sometimes I start with module 7, the content in module 7 and those stories and principles, because that's what that person needs. There's not a linear prescribed program, but I think there's a helpful sequence to these. If I wanted to say generally this is a helpful way to approach it, I put it in that structure. But the reality is this isn't a linear process. These are ideas. And instead of like going through steps to get to our goal, we're really increasing flexibility and expanding a capacity. And it's going in all directions. And we need to expand different parts of ourself in different ways. And there's not like a sequence for that. And that's what's different about ACT. And it was harder for me to learn this approach as a clinician. You couldn't just read a book and be like, okay, step 1, I do this, and then step 2. I actually had to practice these principles and digest them and absorb them and try them out in my life and apply them so I could flexibly share these with other people. But I can tell you, cognitive behavioral therapy is a stepped approach, way easier. I could be like, oh, we're doing session 1. It's prescribed. ACT isn't that. It was a lot harder for me as a clinician to learn this because it's not the way our mind thinks. It's really different than that. And that's why I rejected it initially. I'm like, no, this isn't how it works. My mind's like, nah, I don't like this. But then I realized, oh, yeah, this isn't how our mind thinks. That's exactly what's missing. I need something that captures the limitations of our thinking. And it's ACT, but it's a little bit more challenging. So I don't want people to get through module 1 or 2 and be like, I don't get it. I don't agree with this. I'm done. It's like, yeah, it really is a different way to approach this struggle that your mind hasn't thought about before because it's not able to. It's not equipped for that.
so cool. For people who like to control so much stuff, we far too often seem to like being controlled by the steps and everything. It's so funny to me. But no, I'm so grateful for ACT and its versatility in that way.
Yeah.
Because you're right. I think I like that imagery of it's not linear. It's expansive in all directions. And like I'd rather have that than the straight line. Like
Yeah.
that's a cool visual.
Yeah, I think there's more to it than that straight line. I think about the universe is expanding and I have a hard time conceptualizing how vast the universe is. And I would say our inner world has the potential to be just as vast. And that can be intimidating too. It's like, oh my goodness, like what's in there? Like what is in my mind What is the capacity for what I can feel? My limitations to thought and thinking. I think it's extremely vast. And that can be so intimidating. Your mind's like, nah, let's shut it down. The 12 steps, we're good. It's like, no, we are so much more than a straight line and steps. There's way more capacity. And that can be intimidating, but it's also kind of incredible at the same time.
Absolutely. That's also another cool visual.
So that's module 2. I hope that's helpful for folks that are currently going through the LAP program, or folks that are thinking about going through the program. This is your kind of overview, kind of appetizer, and we go through even more detail in the LAP program. But I just enjoy hearing your thoughts on these and be able to talk about these concepts, but also just really appreciative that these resonated with you and that you found these helpful, that not only connected with your experience, but they helped you change your behavior and live your life in a way that you were looking for.
Absolutely. And I'm beyond grateful for the program in general, but also how specific it is in its organization. And both of these modules, 1 and 2, set you up perfectly for willingness, the next module, and then it just goes from there. And I think if you are mindfully listening and participating in these modules, you will understand what you need to understand from them.
That's well said. Okay, well, I can't wait for willingness, module 3.
I'm excited.
Okay, till next time, Brian.
Okay, bye.
Hey, thanks for listening. Please remember to rate and subscribe. I know you might be facing some issues in your life, or know someone who is. Issues like anxiety, challenges in dealing with emotions, or other compulsive behaviors like unwanted pornography. And I know it's tough to talk to people about problems. Difficult to stare those obstacles down that we face in life and to really know how to deal with them. It's hard to know what to say and when to say it. And then when that moment you finally reach out to family and friends happens, sometimes it falls flat. I haven't found many programs teaching effective strategies like mindfulness, how to improve relationships, and ways to address unwanted pornography viewing through research-supported principles. So whether you simply want to help with a problem like unwanted pornography, difficulty responding to emotions, or just want to understand the world of someone struggling with porn a little better, head over to LifeAfterPornography.com and get in on the next training. There you'll learn the exact same strategies individuals addicted to pornography used to transform their lives by implementing principles from evidence-based treatment shown effective in research for reducing unwanted pornography viewing. You'll learn the secrets, the myths, the enemies to recovery, and the LAP framework for dealing with unwanted porn viewing that we call WAVE. If that's something that interests you, click the link in the description or just head over to LifeAfterPornography.com. I'm Dr. Cameron Staley. See you on the inside.